They said she had planted her garden in a grave. That was the phrase that traveled the crossing at Cottonwood Ford in the summer of 1876, passed hand to hand like a coin worn smooth from telling. The widow Ada Prately had dug a hole in the prairie 8 feet deep, laid glass over the top of it, and buried her seed and her hope in the ground where, everyone agreed, only the dead belonged. The men laughed about it at the freight dock. The women shook their heads over their wash lines. And a boy named Wesley Halloran took to dropping pebbles on the panes just to hear them ring, until his mother swatted him off the sod. Nobody at the crossing understood what that woman was doing under the glass. They would understand before the leaves turned, because there was a thing coming out of the west that summer that would strip every green blade in the county down to black stubble, eat the curtains off the windows and the leather off the harness and the paint, it was said, off a barn door, and leave a whole valley of proud farming families with nothing to plant in the spring. And when it was over, the only living green thing left standing in the entire county would be the buried garden they had all laughed at. But that is getting ahead of the story. And before it is told, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Because stories like this one are meant to be shared at a warm table. Ada Prately was 45 years old, weathered brown at the wrists and pale where her bonnet had shaded her, and she had buried her husband Gideon in April when the fever went through the low ground along the creek. It took him in 9 days. It took 2 of the Odell children the same week, and the old harness maker, and a good bay mare that nobody could explain. Ada had sat with Gideon to the end, wringing creek water over his mouth, and when it was finished she washed him and dressed him in his one good coat and let the neighbors lower him into the sod he had broken with his own plow. Then she came home to a house that had gone very quiet, and a dog that would not leave the door, and a debt. The debt was the part nobody speaks of at a funeral. Gideon Prately had borrowed against 2 good quarters of bottomland to buy seed and a second team the spring before, and when the creditors came, they took the bottomland, the team, the wagon with the green wheels, and the milk cow. What they left her, because not one of them wanted it, was the North Quarter. 160 acres of thin upland grass with a played-out claim shanty and, at the center of it, the caved-in mouth of an old dugout that the first homesteader on that ground had lived in 20 years before, and abandoned when he could stand the dark no longer. The assessor had written the value of the improvements on that quarter as nothing. Not low. Nothing. Silas Crane came to see her about it in May, when the grass was still green and the whole prairie lied to her about what the year would be. Crane was kin, after a fashion. He had married Gideon's sister long ago, and when she died he had kept the family connection as a man keeps a key to a house he means to enter someday. He was the land agent at the crossing now, a soft-handed man in a good gray hat who bought failed claims for the railroad and the eastern speculators and sold them again at a profit that never showed on his face. He sat his horse at her gate and did not get down. "Ada," he said, "you can't work that ground, and you know it. No bottomland, no team, no man. I'll give you $40 for the North Quarter and the trouble of it, and you can take the coach east to your sister's and be shut of this country before the heat comes." $40 for 160 acres and the last thing her husband's name was written on. Ada stood in her doorway with flour on her hands. Her dog, a rough blue cattle dog she called Tam, stood at her knee with his ears forward and his weight on his toes, standing as he stood at a snake. "I'll keep it," Ada said. Crane smiled, patient as a man who owns time. "You'll change your mind by July," he said, and he touched his gray hat and rode back toward town, and that was the first offer. Now here is the thing the crossing did not know about Ada Prately, and the thing that would matter more than any acre of bottomland before the summer was done. She had grown up in a river town in the old country of her childhood, where the winters were long and the ground froze hard, and her grandfather had grown lettuce and young onions and tender greens straight through the frost in a pit he had dug behind the house and roofed with old window sash begged from a glazier. She had knelt at the edge of that pit as a girl with the cold air on her neck and the warm, damp breath of green things rising up into her face, and she had never once forgotten it. The earth, her grandfather told her, does not get as cold as the air, nor as hot. Dig down far enough and the ground stays even all the year, holding the summer's warmth into the winter as a stone in a hearth holds heat long after the fire is out. Put a roof of glass over a hole in that even ground, and you catch the low sun and shut out the wind, and you can raise green things when the world above is dead. Her grandfather called it a pit house. Ada, kneeling in her quiet Kansas kitchen the night after Crane's first offer, called it the only idea she had left. She walked out to the caved-in dugout the next morning with a spade and Tam trotting ahead, and she looked a long while into that dark, broken mouth in the ground. Then she began to dig. She dug for the whole of June. She was not a large woman, but grief will drive a body as nothing else can, and she worked from the gray of dawn until she could no longer see the blade. She squared the old dugout out into a long trench, 8 feet deep and better than 20 feet on the long side, running east and west so the low sun would pour straight down its length. She curbed the walls with sod bricks cut from her own grass and braced the corners with timber salvaged from the fallen claim shanty, packing the earth back hard behind the sod so the walls would not slump. At the deep west end, where the sun would never fully reach, she cut shelves back into the packed clay for storage, because a pit that holds warmth in the winter also holds cool in the summer. And a cool, dark shelf underground is where a careful woman keeps what must not be allowed to sprout too soon, nor rot. The glass was the harder problem, and the crossing enjoyed watching her fail to solve it. 2 summers before, the railroad hotel at the next town down the line had burned to a black shell in a single night. The walls stood. The roof was gone, and the tall windows along its front, the fine glazed sash the railroad had shipped out from the east to make the plains look civilized, had somehow come through the fire hole, blistered a little in their frames but sound. Nobody had bought the ruin. Ada drove the crossing's borrowed mule cart 11 miles to that black shell, and over 4 trips across 3 weeks, she pried loose and carried home better than 30 window sash, each one a wooden frame set with old wavering glass, and she stacked them in the grass beside her pit like the harvest of some strange field. Reuben Salt watched her unload the last cartful. He farmed the good quarter section to her south, and he had never once forgiven Gideon Prately for outbidding him on the bottomland years before. "What in the world are you building, Ada?" he called across the fence, grinning to his hired men. "A church for gophers?" "A garden," she said, and went on stacking glass. She laid the sash flush with the surface of the prairie, edge to edge across the mouth of the pit, resting them on the low curb of sod and timber she had raised just proud of the ground. She bedded each frame in a rope of stiff clay so no gap was left for the wind, and she rigged the 2 center rows on leather hinges cut from an old set of traces, so that she could lift them to reach down inside and lower them again and seal them tight. When it was done, a person walking up on that quarter in the failing light would see, laid into the bare crown of the prairie, a long, low roof of glass at the level of the grass, and beneath it, going down into the dark of the earth, rows of turned black soil waiting for seed. The earth held the warmth, the glass held the light, and Ada Prately climbed down a short-notched ladder into the ground each evening, and knelt in the one place in that whole grieving country that felt, to her, like being held. She planted at high July, when no sane farmer at the crossing would put a tender seed in the open ground and watch it scorch. Down in the pit, sheltered from the killing wind and the hammering sun, cooled by the deep, even earth and lit soft through the old glass, her lettuces and her young onions and her cabbages and her turnips and her beans came up in days. And along the cool, dark shelf at the west end she laid her most careful treasure of all, the thing that would matter beyond any green leaf, though not one soul at the crossing would have guessed it. Seed, sacks and crocks and paper twists of it, the whole of Gideon's saved seed stock that the creditors had not thought worth taking, and every seed she could beg, buy, or trade before the summer closed. Wheat and corn and potato eyes and garden seed, dry and cool and dark under the earth, safe from mouse and weevil and weather. Why keep it down there in the ground? Wesley Halloran asked her once, hanging on her fence. He was 9, and forgiven his pebbles by then, and given to hanging about her place when the chores let him. Because seed is next year, Ada told him. A field is only this year. Anybody can lose a field. But if you keep the seed dry and cool and safe, you can lose the whole field and still have next year in your hand. The boy thought about that, as a child turns over a thing he will not understand until he is old, and then he ran home. The mockery ripened along with everything else. It was Salt who first said the thing about the grave, standing at the crossing store, and the crossing loved it. Because a hard summer wants a small laugh, and here was one that cost nothing. She had planted her garden in a grave. The children took to calling the pit the widow's grave. The men at the freight dock asked one another, loud enough to carry, whether Ada Prately meant to be buried in it herself and save the county the trouble. If you have made it this far into her story, take a breath and stay with it, and go ahead and subscribe if you have not. Because the ones who laughed the loudest at that glass roof are the very ones who will be on their knees at it before the leaves turn. And you will want to be there when they are. Silas Crane came a second time in the first week of August. This time he got down off his horse. He walked the rim of her pit with his hands behind his back and looked down through the wavering glass at the impossible green of it, rows of leaf lettuce and young cabbage glowing in the light like something out of a season that did not belong to that country in August. Something crossed his soft face that Ada had not seen there before. It was not admiration. It was the look of a man doing sums. Clever, he allowed. I'll grant you that. It's a clever bit of foolishness. He turned to her. $30, Ada. I know I said 40 in the spring, but the market's soft and the ground's no better than it was, and 30 in your hand today beats a garden of lettuce you can't sell. Take the coach east. There's nothing for a woman alone out here. 30, he had lowered it. That was Crane's whole art, to make a person feel that every day they waited cost them, that the only safe move was to sell before the price fell again. The price of my ground went up $10 in my own mind while you talked, Ada said. Good day, Silas, he mounted and rode off with his back very straight, and Tam stood at the fence and watched him the whole distance to the road, low in the chest, not barking, only watching, as a good dog watches a thing it does not trust. The first proof came quiet, as proof does. Ada carried a basket of leaf lettuce and young green onions to the crossing store in the middle of August, when every open garden in the county had bolted and burned to bitter stalks, and she set it on the counter, and the storekeeper Amos Rennick looked at that fresh green as though she had carried in snow. He bought the whole basket. His wife bought the next one. Nettie Halloran, Wesley's mother, walked clear out to Ada's fence to ask, shame-faced, whether the widow might sell her a few cabbage starts to try in a shaded corner. and Ada gave them to her and would take nothing. And Nettie went home and told her husband that the woman they had all been laughing at had the only garden left in the county. Tom Halloran did not laugh after that, but Reuben Salt did, and most of the crossing did, because a green basket is a small thing against a whole summer of being sure. And the wheat that August stood tall and gold and heavy in every open field in the county, the best crop the crossing had seen in years. And what did a widow's hole full of lettuce matter against 160 acres of good wheat ready for the reaping? Let her play in her grave, the crossing said. We are going to have a harvest. They were right about the wheat. It was a beautiful crop. They did not know what was coming down the wind to eat it. It came on the 20th of August, a little after noon, and the ones who lived through it would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe a thing that has no proper words. The day started clear and blistering hot. Then, low in the northwest, a haze came up that a body first took for smoke. A dirty brown smudge along the rim of the sky, but it climbed too fast for smoke and it shimmered wrong, and the light went strange and coppery across the wheat. And the air filled with a sound that began as a whisper, and grew until it was a dry, roaring hiss like a hard rain that never fell. Then the sun went out, not clouded. Out the whole brown boiling sky came down on the county at midday and turned noon into a sick amber dusk, and the air was suddenly thick with them, streaking down slantwise like a snow made of brown glass and hunger. The Rocky Mountain locust had come to Kansas. They fell on everything at once. They fell 4 and 5 deep on the standing wheat, and the sound of that beautiful crop being eaten was a sound like fire. A crackling, tearing, chewing hiss that filled the whole world and did not stop. They stripped a field of tall gold wheat down to bare-jointed stubble in under an hour. They fell on the gardens and the cornfields and the orchards, on the grass of the open range, on the leaves of every tree until the trees stood bare as January, though it was high August. And when the green was gone, they ate what was not green. They ate the curtains hanging in open windows. They ate the sweat-stained handles of the hoes and pitchforks left standing in the yards. They ate the harness hung on the barn pegs, the leather of it, the collars, a pair of work gloves left on a rail. They ate the paint off the south side of Tom Halloran's barn and the bark off his young fruit trees so the trees stood white and naked and dying. They fouled the well water and the creek with their drowned brown bodies until the stock would not drink. They lay so deep on the railroad tracks that the noon train from the east ground its wheels and stopped, unable to climb the greased mash of their crushed bodies on the rails. At the north quarter, Ada Prately heard the roaring hiss come up the wind and looked to the northwest and knew it for what it was inside of one breath. Because her grandfather had told her of such things long ago, the years the sky ate the harvest. She did not scream, and she did not run for the road. She ran for her pit. The 2 center sash on their leather hinges were standing open to the August air. She had been down among her rows not an hour before. Now the first of the locusts were already ticking and pattering down out of the coppering sky, striking her shoulders, her bonnet catching in her hair, and the roar of the main body of the swarm was coming on behind them like a wall. Ada threw herself down at the edge of the glass and hauled the first hinged sash up and over, and dropped it into its clay bed and threw her weight on it, and the locusts were coming down thicker now, drumming on the closed panes. And she dragged the second and last sash across the open gap with both hands as the light died, and slammed it down, and latched it, and sealed the last seam of her buried garden against the sky. Then the swarm came down in full, and the world went dark and loud, and Ada Prately climbed down her little ladder into the lantern-lit green of the earth, with her dog Tam pressed shivering against her legs, and she stood among her living rows, and looked up. The glass roof above her head crawled. It heaved and boiled with brown bodies stacked and struggling and eating at one another and clawing at the panes, 3 and 4 deep, blotting out what little day was left, so that the pit went nearly to full dark but for the amber lantern she lit and hung from the center brace. The drumming of them on the glass was a sound she felt in her teeth. Now and again a pain groaned under the weight, and Ada held her breath and watched it. But the old railroad glass, made to face the open plains, held. The clay ropes held. The sod curb held. Not one locust reached the green below. They could smell it, she thought, as a starving thing smells bread through a wall, and they tore at the glass to reach it, and they could not. Down in the warm lantern light, in the smell of turned earth and green leaf, Ada Prately knelt among her cabbages with one hand on her trembling dog and looked up at the boiling dark roof of them, and she was not afraid. She had been afraid in April, watching the fever take Gideon breath by breath, afraid in a way that has no floor to it. This was not that. This was a thing she had built with her own 2 hands, doing exactly the thing she had built it to do. She stayed down in the ground all that day and all that night, feeding Tam by hand, listening to the county being eaten alive above her, and toward dawn she slept a little sitting up against the cool clay wall with the lantern low and the green rose breathing around her in the dark. The locusts stayed 3 days. For 3 days the sky over Cottonwood Ford was brown at noon, and the roaring hiss never stopped, and the people of the crossing shut themselves in their houses and stuffed rags in the door cracks and listened to their year being devoured. Then, on the 3rd day, the wind shifted and warmed, and the whole vast brown host rose up off the ruined country all at once. So many of them that the sound of their wings was like a long roll of thunder that would not break, and they went up into the sky and streamed away to the southeast, and were gone. And the sun came back down on Cottonwood Ford and showed the people what was left. Nothing was left. That was the horror of it. Come the morning of the 4th day. The wheat was gone. The corn was gone. Every stalk chewed to a ragged spike. The gardens were bare dirt. The trees stood skeleton bare, and half of them already dying from the stripped bark. The range grass that fed the cattle was gone to the roots, and the cattle stood bawling in bare lots. The county that 3 days before had stood gold and heavy with the best crop in years now stretched away black and brown and bare to every horizon, a whole world of stubble and dust, as though a fire had passed over it that left the buildings standing and burned only the living green. And it was worse than a fire, though it took the crossing a few days of stunned counting to understand exactly how much worse. A fire takes this year. The people of the crossing, walking their ruined fields in a daze, came slowly to the thing that turned their stomachs to water. It was not only that they had no crop to sell and no hay to winter the stock and no garden to eat from through the cold. It was that they had nothing to plant in the spring. The seed wheat, the seed corn, the garden seed, the potatoes held back for eyes, all of it had been in the fields and the gardens and the open bins, and all of it was gone, eaten, fouled, or fed to the flames of the swarm. A man with no crop can borrow and eat and hold on to next year. A man with no seed has no next year to hold on to. The whole county faced a winter of hunger and, on the far side of that winter, a spring with nothing to put in the ground. On the north quarter, the widow's grave glowed green. Ada opened her pit on the 4th morning and climbed up into a changed world, and Tam went up the ladder ahead of her and stood on the crown of the prairie and barked once at the strangeness of it. The silence, the bare black country. She brushed the crushed and dead locusts off her glass roof with a broom, sweeping drifts of them off into the dead grass. And when the panes were clear, the low morning sun poured down into the pit and lit her rose, and there it all was, whole and green and untouched. Leaf lettuce and cabbage and young onions and turnips and beans, thriving in the even warm earth. And along the cool dark shelf at the west end, dry and safe and sound, the seed. Gideon's saved seed stock and every seed she had gathered, wheat and corn and potato eyes and garden seed enough, if it were shared out careful and planted thin, to put a start back into a whole county's fields. She stood a long while looking at it, understanding what she held. Then she climbed out and began to fill a basket with green leaves, because whatever came next, people were going to be hungry today, and a hungry person is not helped by seed for a spring they cannot imagine yet. They are helped by something green to put in a child's mouth this noon. Nettie Halloran was the first to come, on the 5th day, and she did not come laughing. She came leading her 2 youngest by the hand, thin already with the fear of the winter on her, and she stood at Ada's fence and could not make the words come. And Ada simply filled her arms with green food and cabbage starts and told her to send Tom over with the mule cart. Word of that went back to the crossing faster than any joke ever had. By the 6th day they were coming up the road to the north quarter in 1s and 2s. The same people who had called her pit a grave, and they came to the rim of the glass and looked down into the green glowing rose in the lantern light of the earth. And more than one of them wept, standing there, at the sight of a living thing. Ada fed them. She would not sell the green food, and she would not take money for it. She stood at the lip of her pit and handed up baskets and told each family what she could spare, and told them plainly what she could not. And she made them a promise that steadied the crossing more than any preacher's words. There was seed, she said. Not enough to plant every acre as before, but enough, planted thin and shared honest, to put a crop back into every family's best ground in the spring, and enough garden seed to feed them through the summer after this terrible one. No family that dealt square with her would go into that spring with empty hands. She would keep the seed cool and dark and safe in the ground where the swarm could not reach it, the same as she had kept it safe through the 3 days. And in the spring she would share it out. On what terms? Tom Halloran asked her, standing at the glass with his hat in his hands, because a proud man needs to know the price of a thing before he can bear to take it. Ada thought about the answer a good while, because she had lived long enough to know that a gift with no cost teaches nothing, and often breaks the one who takes it. "You'll each plant a share back into my keeping at harvest," she said at last. "As much seed as I hand you in the spring, you return to this pit in the fall, cleaned and dry, and a little over for the storing, so that if the sky ever eats the county again, the county has a seed store in the ground it can trust, and no widow's grave to laugh at, only a bank that grows things. And you'll help me build a second pit before the snow, twice the size of this one, to hold it." She looked around at their faces. That's the whole of my terms. It was, they all knew, the fairest bargain any of them had ever been offered, and it was offered by the woman they had mocked, and the shame of that and the mercy of it together bent the pride right out of them. Tom Halloran put out his hard hand, and she took it, and that was the seal. Silas Crane came last, and he came on foot. He had lost, it turned out, more than the crossing knew. He had bought up 3 failed quarters that spring on borrowed Eastern money, meaning to hold them and sell them dear, and every acre of them stood black and worthless now, and the notes on them were coming due, and the railroad he brokered for had no use for a country that could not ship a single bushel east that year. The soft-handed man in the good gray hat had gambled on other men's ruin and been ruined worse. And now he came up the road to the north quarter he had tried twice to buy for less than nothing, and he stood over the buried garden he had called a clever bit of foolishness. And he looked down through the wavering glass at the only green and the only seed and the only future left in the county of Cottonwood Ford. And Ada Prately let him stand there in the silence a good long while before she spoke. "You said there was nothing out here for a widow with no man to her name, Silas," she said. Crane took off his gray hat. It was the first time she had ever seen his head bare, and he looked older with it off and smaller. "I did say that," he said. "I've corn and wheat seed enough to give even you a start," Ada said. "The same as any man at the crossing, on the same terms as any man at the crossing. A share back into the ground at harvest, and your 2 hands on the new pit before the snow. That's all. I'll not have you begging at my glass, Silas. Kneeling doesn't grow anything. Working does. Stand up and take the bargain or don't." He stood a moment more. Then Silas Crane, land agent, put his gray hat back on his head and got down on his knees in the dead grass all the same, not to beg but to see, and looked down into the green earth for a long, long time, at the rows of living leaves glowing under the glass in the lantern light, and when he stood up something in his face had changed for good. "I never once thought about the ground being warmer than the air," he said, quietly, almost to himself, "all these years selling it. I never once thought about what was under it." "Most people don't," Ada said. "Come back at first light. There's a pit to dig." They dug it in the second week of September. The whole crossing turned out along the crown of the north quarter. Tom Halloran and his boys, and Reuben Salt, who could not meet her eye and worked twice as hard for it, and Amos Rennick from the store, and Nettie and the women cutting sod, and Wesley and the other children hauling the salvaged sash up from the wagons, and Silas Crane in his shirt sleeves at the bottom of the trench with a spade, his soft hands blistering, saying nothing, digging. They dug a pit twice the length of the first, running east and west to catch the low winter sun, curbed with sod and braced with timber, and they roofed it flush with the prairie in rows of old railroad glass, and along its deep, cool western shelf, before the first snow flew, they laid up the shared seed of a whole county, dry and dark and safe in the even earth where no swarm and no winter and no ruin could reach it. And that is how it came to be that in the black and hungry autumn after the grasshopper year, the 2 brightest things on the whole ruined face of Cottonwood Ford were a pair of long, low roofs of glass set flush into the crown of a north quarter that the assessor had valued at nothing. Glowing amber from the lantern light and the low sun and the green of living things down in the held warmth of the earth. The county wintered on the food from those pits and on the hope of the seed beneath them, and in the spring planted thin and shared honest. That seed put a crop back into the ground, and the crop came up green, and the county lived. They never called it the widow's grave again. They called it Prately's ground, and later, just the ground, the name you give a thing you have decided to trust. And for years after, when the crossing put down its seed for the winter, the children were told the story of the summer the sky turned brown and ate the world, and the one woman who had thought to plant her next year deep in the earth where nothing could get at it, and had fed a whole county out of a hole they had all laughed at. Ada Prately kept the ground the rest of her long life, and she kept the seed bank in it, and she took a share and gave a share every year until she was too old to hold a spade, and Wesley Halloran, grown into a broad, quiet man, dug the pits after her. She never grew rich, as Silas Crane had once measured riches. But she never again heard a soul at Cottonwood Ford say there was nothing out there for a widow, with no man to her name. And on the coldest nights of the hardest winters, when the wind came down off the plains and the whole world above the ground froze black and still, she would climb down into the lantern-lit green by that same notched ladder with her old dog Gray at the muzzle beside her, and she would kneel among the living rows in the held warmth of the earth, and she would think of her grandfather in that far river town, and of Gideon in the sod, and of a boy dropping pebbles on the glass, and she would feel, as she had felt as a girl, exactly like being held. The earth does not get as cold as the air, nor as hot. Dig down far enough, and there is warmth waiting that the surface of the world forgets it holds. Maybe that is the part most of us miss, walking around up here in the wind so sure of what is worthless and what is not. The thing they buried in a grave turned out to be the only thing alive. The next year they thought they had lost turned out to be safe in the dark all along, waiting for hands patient enough to keep it. So here is the question to carry to your own warm table tonight. If the whole county was laughing at you, and the assessor had written your last acre down as worth nothing at all, would you have had the nerve to dig your garden down into the ground where they said only the dead belonged, and trust the cold earth to hold your next year safe? Or would you have planted in the open with everybody else and taken your chances with the sky? Tell us in the comments where you are listening from and what you would have done, and if this story warmed you, stay a while, because there are more like it waiting.